Thank you very much. Thank you very much for that very warm welcome. And it is a delight to be in Colorado again, but I'll be leaving tomorrow morning before the snow. The title of my talk tonight is The Legitimate Role of Government in a Free Society. Now, in the course of my comments, I'm going to say things that will break with conventional wisdom on a whole range of topics. I'm going to say some things that might sound mean, mean-spirited, uncaring, and politically incorrect. And to the extent that any of those things are true, if we have a chance, you should raise a question or two. We'll leave that up to John. And don't worry about insulting me. I am uninsultable. The only way you could possibly insult me is to suggest that I'm not pretty good in basketball. And that's a matter of ethnic pride that I take seriously. Now, one of the justifications for the growth of government far beyond what the founders envisioned for us, the justification is to promote fairness and justice. Well, that might be a worthy goal, but we might also ask, what is fairness and justice? What is the legitimate role of government in a free society? Let me just spend a few minutes discussing what the founders saw as the legitimate role of government. And to do that, let's turn to the rule book that they gave us, namely the United States Constitution. Now, most of what the founders saw as the legitimate role for the federal government is found in Article 1, Section 8 of the United States Constitution. Let me just briefly quote sections thereof. It says, Congress shall have the power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, excises to pay the debts and provide for the common defense and the general welfare of the United States. The Congress is authorized to borrow money on the credit of the United States, to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states and with Indian tribes, to coin money, to establish post offices and post roads, to raise and support armies. The framers granted Congress taxing and spending authority for these and a few other activities. Now, nowhere in the Constitution do we find authority for Congress to tax and spend up to 3/4 of what Congress taxes and spends today. In other words, there is no constitutional authority for farm subsidies, bank bailouts, food stamps, and not to mention midnight basketball. We can safely say that we made a significant departure from the constitutional principles of individual liberty and limited government. And it was indeed limited government that made us a rich nation in the first place. And the principles, these principles of freedom were embodied in our nation through the combined institutions of private ownership of property and free enterprise. Now, by the way, you might have some people tell you, well, gee, Walter Williams is being very narrow about the Constitution because the Constitution is a living document. Now, anyone who tells you that the Constitution is a living document is also telling you that we don't have a Constitution. Because for the rules of the game to mean anything, they must be fixed. And the founders, in their wisdom, they gave us Article 5 as a means to amend the Constitution if we have to. And those of you who think that the Constitution is a living document, that's okay. Well, I have the question to ask you. How many of you would like to play me poker tonight and the rules be living? I mean, maybe my two pair can beat your three of a kind under certain circumstances. Now, through numerous successful attacks, private property and free enterprise that the framers envisioned are mere skeletons of their past. Thomas Jefferson anticipated this when he said, "The natural progress of things is for government to gain ground and for liberty to yield." The best way of looking at this process of government gaining ground is to look at what has happened to government taxation and spending. Ladies and gentlemen, there's only one way to look at taxes. Taxes represent government claims on private property. Indeed, if the government were to tax private property at 100%, it would just plain confiscate private property. An even better measure of what government does is look at what has happened to spending. And let's look at what has happened to spending over our history. In 1902, expenditures at all levels of government, federal, state, and local levels of government, totaled $1.7 billion. In 1902, the average taxpayer paid $60 in federal, state, and local taxes. In fact, from 1787 until 1920, federal expenditures were only 3% of the GDP, except during wartime. Today, federal expenditures are approaching 25% of the GDP. State and local governments, their expenditures are close to $3 trillion. The average taxpayer today pays more than $10,000 a year in federal, state, and local taxes. Now, what's the significance of this? Well, the significance is that as time goes by, you and I own less and less of our most valuable property, namely ourselves and the fruits of our labor. Another way to look at this is to recognize that the average taxpayer works from January 1st until near the end of April to pay federal, state, and local taxes. That is, we are working going on 5 months out of the year where we do not have the rights to decide how the fruits of our labor will be used. Somebody else makes that decision. Keep in mind that a working definition of slavery is that you work 12 months out of the year, and it's someone else that decides how the fruits of your labor will be used. Now, through numerous successful attacks, private property and free enterprise are mere skeletons of their past, as Thomas Jefferson suggested. In the economic sphere, the founders thought that relatively free markets, or what's called capitalism, was the most effective social organization for the promotion of individual freedom. Indeed, capitalism is defined as a system wherein individuals are free to pursue their own interests so long as they do not violate the property rights of others. There is voluntary exchange. There are private property rights held in goods and services. Much of the original intent of the United States Constitution, as seen in the document itself, and Federalist Papers and other documents that debated the Constitution, was to bring about a climate in which this kind of social organization could occur. The great benefit of the free enterprise system is that through private ownership and control, it minimizes the capacity of one person to coerce another person. Additionally, the coercive powers of the state are minimized. They're restricted to the legitimate functions of the state in a free society. And what are the legitimate functions? Well, One legitimate function of the state in a free society is to protect you and me against international thugs violating our private property rights. So that says one legitimate function of the government is to provide for national defense. Another legitimate function of government at some level is to prevent domestic thugs from violating our private property rights, and so that says there should be police services at some level. Other legitimate functions of government in a free society are those of enforcing constitutional order, the adjudication of disputes, and the provision of certain public goods as an economist would define them. In order to pay for these legitimate and constitutionally mandated functions of government, each citizen is obliged to pay his share. Now, for the past half century, free enterprise and what it implies has been under unrelenting attack in our country. Americans from all walks of life, whether they realize it or not, have demonstrated a deep and abiding contempt for private property and economic freedom. Free enterprise is threatened in our country not because of its failure, but somewhat ironically, free enterprise is threatened today because of its success. That is, capitalism, or free enterprise, I use those terms interchangeably, has been so successful in eliminating the traditional problems of mankind, disease, pestilence, gross hunger, and poverty, that all other human problems appear to us to be at once inexcusable and unbearable. The desire by many Americans to eliminate these so-called unbearable and inexcusable problems have led us away from the basic ideals and principles upon which our prosperous nation was built. In the name of other ideals, such as equality of income, sex and race balance, affordable housing, medical care, orderly markets, consumer protection, energy conservation, just to name a few, we have abandoned many personal freedoms. As a result of widespread control by government in an effort to achieve these so-called higher objectives, we are increasingly being subordinated to the point where considerations of personal liberty are but secondary and tertiary matters. They're treated like dirt in our country. Now you might say, well, Williams, aren't you exaggerating that personal freedoms are treated like dirt in our country? Well, let me ask you a question. Suppose I write a letter to the United States Congress, and I tell them, my name is Walter Williams. I am an emancipated adult. I am fully capable of taking care of my own retirement needs. If I fail to do so, let me starve on the streets or go begging, but stop taking money out of my paycheck for Social Security. How do you think that will be greeted? It'd be greeted with contempt. That is, here are some people telling me and telling you how much we should set aside each week out of our pay for retirement. What would we think? Suppose they told us how much to set aside out of our week's pay for housing, for our children's education, for food, for entertainment. You'd view it as tyranny. But here are some people telling us under the penalty of jail what we should do. That's what I mean when I say that liberty is increasingly treated as dirt in our country. Now, the ultimate end to this process is totalitarianism, which is nothing more than a reduced form of servitude. I am not saying that we are a totalitarian nation yet. But if you ask the question, which way are we headed, tiny steps at a time? Are we headed towards more liberty or towards more government control over our lives? It would have to unambiguously be the latter. And keep in mind that if you take tiny steps towards any goal, it's just a matter of when you'll be there. Or as the great philosopher David Hume said, it's seldom that liberty of any kind is lost all at once. It's always lost bit by bit. Or as my late colleague Leonard Reed put it, if you wanted to take liberty away from Americans, you had to know how to cook a frog. Leonard Reed said, you cannot cook a frog by putting the frog in a pot of boiling water because the frog's reflexes are so quick that as soon as his feet hit the boiling water, he would hop away and be free. Leonard Reed said that the way to cook a frog is to put on a pot of cold water and heat it up bit by bit. And by the time the frog realized he was being cooked, it was too late. That's the same thing with Americans. If anybody came over here talking about taking away our liberties all at once, we would righteously rebel. But they can talk about taking away our liberties bit by bit. Now, the primary justification for this attack on personal liberty and private property rights can be found in people's desire for government to do good. We all say things like, government should care for the poor. Government should help the elderly. Government should help the disadvantaged. Government should have a safety net. Government should help failing business. Government should help college students and other deserving segments of our society. Well, it's nice to say those things, but we have to recognize that government has no resources of its very own. Now, when I say government has no resources of its very own, what I mean by that, ladies and gentlemen, that the money coming to you or any coming out of Washington does not represent congressmen and senators reaching into their own pockets to send out the money. Now, when you recognize that government has no resources of its very own, that forces you to recognize that the only way the government can give one American citizen $1 is to first, through intimidation, threats, and coercion, confiscate that dollar from some other American. Now, if you think I'm being too loose with the words intimidation, threats, and coercion, you have April 15th to check me out on this. You can tell the agents of the United States Congress that you will pay for the constitutionally mandated functions of the federal government, but you will not pay for other things. You will see all the intimidation, threats, and coercion that you want to see. Now, we Americans, ask government to do things that if the identical thing was done privately, we would roundly condemn that person doing it as an ordinary, low-down, despicable thief. Now, for example, I could see an elderly lady sleeping on the grate in downtown Denver. The lady's hungry, she needs some medical attention and some shelter. I could walk up to John with a gun in my hand. I say, John, give me your $200. Then having gotten this $200, I could go down and buy the lady some medical attention, some food, and some shelter. Would you find me guilty of a crime? Of course, I'd be guilty of theft regardless of what I did with the money. And I believe most Americans would agree with me on that. But here's the problem. Suppose the agents of the United States Congress, they come up to me and say, Williams, you know that $200 that you made last week, that you planned to buy a bottle of Lafite Rothschild Bordeaux wine with it? You will not do that with the money. You'll give it to us, and we will go downtown and help the lady out. I assert that there's no conceptual distinction between those two acts. If you press me for a distinction, only one I could give is that the first act, where I walked up John, that is illegal theft. The second act is legal theft. Both acts involve taking the rightful property of one person and giving it to another to whom it does not belong. Well, you might say, well, Williams, it's legal, But moral people cannot allow legality alone to be their guide, because there are many things in this world that are or were legal, but clearly immoral. That is, slavery was legal. Was it moral? Apartheid was legal, and South Africa was moral. The Nazis' persecution of Jews, Stalin's purges, and many other things were legal, but were they moral? That is the moral question that we have to ask ourselves as Americans. Is there a moral case for taking what belongs to one person and giving it to another to whom it does not belong? Now, don't misunderstand me. I believe in helping our fellow man in need. I believe that reaching into one's own pockets to help one's fellow man in need is praiseworthy and laudable. I believe in reaching in somebody else's pockets to help one's fellow man in need is worthy of condemnation. Now, and for the Christians among us, we have to keep in mind that when God gave Moses the commandment, thou shalt not steal, I'm quite sure he didn't mean thou shalt not steal unless you got a majority vote in Congress. Now, in a free society, we want our relationships to be voluntary. And we want to minimize involuntary relationships, such as I've been mentioning. Or another way, a lot of people get hung up on the terminology involuntary versus voluntary. I always tell people, I love seduction. That's what voluntary transactions are. It's seduction. Now, let me give you an example, because a lot of people are young in here and their hormones in uproar and they misunderstand me. But well, what's the essence of seduction? Seduction is when we proposition our fellow man in the following way. We say to him, if you make me feel good, I'll make you feel good. That is, for those of us who remember game theory, that's a positive sum game. Let me give you an example of it. I walk into the grocer with $3 in my hand, and I proposition him. I say, if you make me feel good, give me that gallon of milk. I'll make you feel good, give you $3. If the transaction occurs, he's better off because he valued the $3 more than the milk, and I'm better off because I valued the milk more than $3. That's what I mean when I say it's a positive sum game. Now, rape, on the other hand, is when we proposition our fellow man in the following way. Unless you make me feel good, I'm going to make you feel bad. And that would be a case where I walked up to the grocer with a gun in my hand. And I proposition him. I say, if you don't make me feel good by giving me that gallon of milk, I'm going to make you feel bad, blow your brains out. Clearly, I'm better off, but he's worse off. Now, a lot of people say, well, Williams, these things that you rail against, well, we're a democracy, and there's majority rule. Well, first, I try to explain to people that the framers did not intend for us to be a democracy. But more importantly, I don't find gang rape any better than individualized rape. That is. In other words, or to put it more politely, a majority consensus does not establish morality. Now, widespread private ownership and control over property is consistent with seduction. Widespread government ownership and control is consistent with rape. Now, a lot of people say, well, look, we need big government to deal with the big, powerful business. Well, that's just plain nonsense. Despite the alleged power of industrial giants like IBM, General Motors, et cetera, or Exxon, in a free market, how can they get $1 from us? Well, let's look at Exxon. How can Exxon get $1 from me? I must voluntarily get out of my chair, voluntarily get into my car, voluntarily drive in this man's lot, and voluntarily hand him some money for some gasoline. Where's the coercion? Now, government can get dollars from me whether I want to give it to them or not, even if it requires going over my dead body. Now, I would be remiss if I did not point out that government, that big business can get dollars from us, whether we want to give it to them or not. But what do they have to do first? They have to go to the United States Congress or our state legislators to get permission to rip us off. And that's the big job of politicians, to give people permission to rip us off. For example, say, the farmers are having trouble. Some farmers are having trouble. Now, the farmers know where I live. I live in Valley Forge, Pennsylvania. Now, if the farmers are having trouble, they can come and knock on my door and say, buddy, can you spare a dime? Now, I'd probably tell the farmers to go play in the traffic. And they know that. So they'll go to their senator and say, if we ask Williams to help us out voluntarily, he's going to tell us to go play in the traffic, so could you use your agents, namely the IRS, to take his money and give it to us? That's how big business gets money from us, whether we want to give it to them or not. They get permission from our elected representatives. Free markets and voluntary exchange are roundly denounced by today's defenders of what I call the new human rights. These defenders are the chief supporters of reduced private property rights, reduced rights to profits. They are anti-competition and pro-monopoly. They're pro-control and coercion by the state. These people believe that they are more intelligent and have superior wisdom to the rest of us. And they believe that God has ordained them to forcibly impose that wisdom on the rest of us. Now, of course, they have what they consider to be good reasons for restricting the freedoms of others. But I'm here to tell you that every tyrant has had what the tyrant believed to be good reasons for restricting the freedoms of others. Their plan requires the elimination or the attenuation of the free market. Why do tyrants want to eliminate the free market? Because the free market implies voluntary exchange, and tyrants do not trust people behaving voluntarily will do what the tyrant thinks that they ought to do. So they want to replace the market with economic planning, industrial planning. Now, I'll give you a definition of economic planning that will last you the rest of your lives. Economic planning is nothing more than the forcible superseding of somebody else's plan by the powerful elite. Let me give you an example there. My daughter might plan to work for the hardware store guy down the street for $4 an hour. He says it's okay. She says it's okay. Her mother says it's okay. Her father says it's okay. But the powerful elite will supersede that plan because it's not being transacted at the prices they think it ought to be transacted at, namely $7.25 an hour. I might plan to buy a Honda motorcycle from a Japanese producer. The powerful elite will say, we're going to supersede that plan through tariffs and quotas because we think you ought to buy a Harley Davidson. Now, as I said, many people do this in the name of good. Many of them just plain evil, but many do it in the name of good. But do-gooders fail to realize that most good done in the world is not done in the name of good. And in fact, if you were to ask me, Williams, what's that wonderful human motivation that gets wonderful things done? I would say greed. I love greed. Now I'm not talking about ripping off people, fraud, robbing, things. I'm talking about people trying to get as much as they can for themselves. Let me give you an example of this. I mean, you had Texas cattle ranchers this winter getting up in the dead of night, going out in blizzards maybe, running down stray cows, trying to feed them, maybe getting kicked by the cows. making this personal sacrifice to make sure New Yorkers had beef on their shelves. You have Idaho potato farmers this summer. They'll be working, doing back-breaking work, sun beating down them, bugs biting them, dirt underneath their fingernails, making this personal sacrifice to make sure New Yorkers have potatoes on their shelves. Now, why do you think they're doing it? You think they're doing that because they love New Yorkers? They may hate New Yorkers. I'm not wild about New Yorkers myself. But they see that that beef and potatoes gets to New York every single day of the week. Why? Because they love themselves. They're trying to get more for themselves. Now ask yourself the question, how much beef and potatoes do you think New Yorkers would have on their shelves if it all depended on human love and kindness? I'd be worried about New Yorkers. And let me just give you another example, because if I don't tell you these things, you're going to spend the rest of your life not knowing them. Let me give you another example of the virtue of, some people tell me, well, William, since you're trying to win friends and influence people, instead of saying greed, why don't you say enlightened self-interest? Well, enlightened self-interest is okay, but I like greed because it's more descriptive. But let me give you another example. I frequently tell people that I don't care much about future generations in America. Some people, they're laughing and stuff like that. Some people say, well, Williams, how come you don't care about future generations? And I ask, well, what have future generations ever done for me? I mean, some kid that's going to be born in 2050, what has he done for me? And if he has not done anything for me, how then am I obliged to do anything for him? Where's the quid pro quo? But however, if you watch my actual behavior, my behavior would belie that sentiment. I have a nice spread in Valley Forge, Pennsylvania. And several years ago, I took $400 that I could have consumed selfishly buying 2 nice bottles of Chateau de Chem Sauterne wine. But instead of doing that, I bought seedlings to plant on my property. Now, when those trees reach their full maturity, I'll be dead. There'll be some 20, 50 kids swinging in my trees, 20, 50 kids eating my apples and my pears. A number of years ago, Mrs. Williams made extensive improvements on our house, with my money, of course. Had a really nice sunroom. And that sunroom is going to outlive both of us. There'll be some 20, 50 kids tracking mud in my sunroom. Now, you might ask the question, why did I make, what's at least some of the reason I made sacrifices of current consumption to produce some good that's going to long outlast me? The answer is very easy. The longer my house will provide housing services, the nicer it is, the higher the price I get when I go to sell the house. That is, by pursuing my own narrow selfish interest, I can't help but make a house available for a future generation, whether I mean to or not. Now ask yourself the question, would I have the same incentives if the government owned my house? Or would I have the same incentives if there were a 75% transfer tax when I went to sell my house? No, whatever weakens my private property rights in that house weakens my incentive to do the socially responsible thing. Let me begin to close because we're running out of time here. Now, the big problem in our country is that almost every group in our nation has come to feel that the government owes them a special privilege or a favor. And people who call themselves conservatives are by no means exempt from this practice. That is, manufacturers feel that government owes them protective tariffs, that is, to keep foreign goods out so they can charge us higher prices. Farmers feel that government owes them crop subsidies. Organized labor feels that government should keep their jobs protected from those who are not union members. College professors and intellectuals feel that government should give them funds for research. College professors love to get $100,000, $200,000 grants to do studies on poverty and meet in a nice hotel in the winter in Miami to talk about poor people. Almost every occupation, profession, or trade feels the government owes them special privileges. Now, conservatives rail against things like food stamps, aid to families-dependent children, legal aid, but they come out in support for aid to dependent farmers, aid to dependent banks, and aid to dependent motorcycle companies. As such, they don't have a moral leg to stand on. They just prove that it's a matter of whose ox is being gored. Conservatives as well as liberals, Democrats as well as Republicans, prove H.L. Mencken's definition of an election quite correct. H.L. Mencken, for those of you who have forgotten, was a political satirist for the Baltimore Sun. And somebody asked H.L. Mencken to give a definition of an election, And H.L. Mencken replied, "Government is a broker in pillage, and every election is an advance auction and sale of stolen goods." Now, to the extent H.L. Mencken is correct, I believe he is correct, we've identified our problem. Too many of us blame politicians for our problems. And yes, we can blame them a little bit, but ladies and gentlemen, the bulk of the blame lies with you and me. That is, politicians are doing precisely what we elect them to office to do. And what do we elect them to office to do? We elect them to office to take what belongs to one American and bring it back to them. Now, you might say, Williams, look, you have come all the way out from Valley Forge to insult us in Colorado. We don't do that. But let me ask you this question. Suppose I were running for the United States Senate in Colorado. No. Suppose I were running, and I go back and forth across the state. I say, look, if you elect me to the Senate, don't expect for me to try to bring back highway construction funds, aid to higher education, farm subsidies, and all these other programs, prescription drugs. Do you think I would get elected to the Senate from Colorado? No, I wouldn't. And the reason why is because I wouldn't be doing what Coloradans wanted me to do, people of Colorado. And the people of Colorado would be absolutely correct not electing me to the Senate. Why? Because if I don't endeavor to bring back all these goodies to you, it does not mean that people in Colorado will pay a lower federal income tax. All that it means is that Minnesota will get it instead. That is, once legalized theft begins, it pays for everybody to participate in it. And for those who don't participate in it, they'll wind up holding the brown end of the stick. And those of you with a rural background, you know what that means. Now let me just kind of close by saying that we have a big problem in our nation. The most optimistic thing that I see is that we Americans have not done the wrong thing for a long time. We've always managed to get our act together. But we better be about getting our act together while we still have the liberty to do so. We have another burden as Americans. That is, if liberty is lost in America, I believe it is lost for all times, all people around the world. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. John says there's time for a couple questions. Two questions, right? Okay. That guy with a nice tie on waving his hand. And speak loudly. Well, you know, when we were growing up, we lived in the Richard Allen Housing Project in North Philadelphia. And my mother used to tell me, don't be like that kid. He's silly and he's foolish and he's never going to get anywhere. Now, Mom was right about most things, but she was wrong about that one. I mean, he's a comic extraordinaire, and I think recently he's come to his senses in many respects. So, and we both served on the Temple University's board of trustees for a while, and I got to know him. It kind of reacquaint myself with him, but I don't see him much anymore. There's another question. I don't know who to ask. Oh, it's so hard. Huh? No, yeah, that I would love that, but we don't have time. Let the senior fellow. Well, he was asking, what kind of response do I get from students, my students, to these philosophical statements that I make? Well, I teach at George Mason University. I'm starting my 34th year. I teach our first year PhD students microeconomic theory, and I teach in the spring the intermediate microeconomic theory. Now, in my classroom, the first day of class, I tell the students that they're not going to be graded on my opinion on anything, because my opinion is not that, it's just my opinion. And I tell them that they should raise their hand if I say something and I don't preface it with, in my opinion. They should raise their hand and say, Professor Williams, we're not taking this class to be indoctrinated with your ideas. Because so in a nutshell, I don't discuss anything like I'm discussing in class, because I think that it's academic dishonesty to use one's classroom to proselytize students. Now, I would say that I would love for students to have my ideas, to share my values. And I think if I teach them how to think rigorously and hard-mindedness, they're going to come up with my ideas anyway. They're going to come up with it on their own. Did you say one more? Okay, this fellow with, yeah, the gentleman there, yeah. Okay, the question was, what are my ideas on the Federal Reserve and quantitative easing, which really mean printing money, or some people would call it counterfeiting, in my opinion. As a matter of fact, I've suggested to people that if they're ever on trial charged with counterfeiting, just tell the judge they were engaging in monetary policy. But I think that the Federal Reserve system has been somewhat of a disaster for our country. And you can do it just as simple before and after. The Federal Reserve Act was written, I think, 1912, or 1912, I think. And if you look at the number of bank failures before 1912 and compare it with after 1912, they were far greater after the Federal Reserve Act. If you look at price stability, one of the charges of the Federal Reserve was to create price stability. And you look at price stability before the Federal Reserve and after, you'll see that price stability in our country was much greater before the Federal Reserve. What the Federal Reserve and its ability to print money, it allows the United States government to steal from its citizens by inflating the currency. And I think that we should have some challenge, at least an audit to the Federal Reserve. And I think also that we should have, I would like to get rid of some of the legal tender laws whereby people can make transactions in precious metals without being taxed on it. Thank you very much.